Ladies and gentlemen, let me warmly welcome you to today's webinar organized by the Sri Lanka Institute of Directors in partnership with the Center for Creative Leadership and the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. We at the Sri Lanka Institute of Directors stand firmly in the forefront of promoting good governance in companies across various industries and in providing best-in-class board leadership training to practicing and aspiring directors in both the private and public sectors. The Institute's forums provide insightful discussions with experienced and knowledgeable panels exploring a range of practical examples and boardroom experience. The Center for Creative Leadership, CCL, is a top-ranked global provider of leadership development. Their array of cutting-edge solutions is steeped in extensive research and experience gained from working with hundreds of thousands of leaders at all levels. Ranked among the world's top providers of executive education, CCL has locations in countries worldwide. In Asia, CCL has 3 offices in China, India, and Singapore. We are also fortunate to partner with the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, the premier forum for business in Sri Lanka. I now take great pleasure in introducing our panel for today. Rajendra Tyagaraja, Managing Director, CEO of Cargill's Bank. Aroshina Nekara, CEO of Global Consulting Company. Rainer Deutschmann, Group Chief Operating Officer of Dialogue Asiata. And last but not least, Anushka Vijay-Singha, Economist and Non-Executive Director, Ceylon Bank PLC and Fairfirst Insurance Limited. And now to hand over the session to our moderator for today, Sunil Puri, Senior Research Director, Head of Research for Asia Pacific at CCL. We trust you'll benefit from this webinar and our growing series of online programs. Thank you for joining us. A couple of housekeeping rules before I hand over to Sunil. Please ensure that you log in and remain mute throughout the session. Please switch off your video function throughout the session. Should you have any question that you wish to ask from our panel of experts, you may type in your questions in the chat box and we will direct the questions to the panelists. Thank you. Over to you, Sunil.
Hey, thank you, Radhika, and thanks for introducing CCL and the partners here. My name is Sunil, and I head up research at the Center for Creative Leadership. I head up research for the Asia Pacific operations. And as Radhika pointed out, a lot of our work that we do is steeped and deep-rooted in research. We are a gold standard in leadership development, and I'll share with you today one of the research studies that we completed a couple of months ago on board leadership. Now, let me share my screen with you. I have a short presentation deck, and I'll be sharing the key takeaways of the study, and then we'll bring the study to life by the wonderful panel and very senior panel we are fortunate to have with us this afternoon. So if you think about the topic of governance, and I would encourage you to reflect and think about any country, not only Sri Lanka, think about any country that you can think of or you are familiar with, and think about the corporate developments in that country, let's say over the past couple of years. And I'm sure you can identify or think of at least a few governance breakdowns or corporate governance failures in that particular country, irrespective of the country size, irrespective of the location, irrespective of whether the country is developed or developing, size of the country, population of the country, GDP, and so on. All countries have kind of sort of witnessed big and small corporate governance failures. And I'm hoping you will agree with me that, spectacular board failures, they get all the attention. So media covers those, you'll see those in live television. Academics or quasi-academics like me will write cases on those. We'll hear about those on internet. People will tweet about those failures. But underperforming boards, I repeat, underperforming boards are almost never talked about. And they are equally or even more dangerous because they slowly eat into the shareholder wealth and stakeholder confidence. Now, why do boards underperform? What makes leaders at the board level not be able to give their best to the organization? What does a next generation board leader look like? What are the critical capabilities board leaders must have to take us further? Especially in times like these when the post-COVID world will look very different. So we asked some of these questions in the Bold 3.0 study. We looked at board directors across 6 to 8 countries. We interviewed 109 board directors across Asia, and we surveyed another 350, including a small sample set from Sri Lanka. We asked these questions, and I'll be sharing the responses and answers to some of these questions as I go along. The one big learning we had was that as Asia is presented with unprecedented opportunities and is faced with unprecedented risks, the boards need to do much more than supervisory and stewardship responsibilities. They need to do more than that. And apologies to share the bad news upfront, our boards across most of developing Asia, most of developing ASEAN and South Asia are not ready to play that role. Let me start the sharing by what you already know. Now, mostly business heads, senior business executives, and board leaders with us this afternoon. And you guys have a tough job, running your organizations, managing teams, driving initiatives. And then, in situations like these, when a pandemic hit, all hell breaks loose. Also, a critical piece of your responsibility is managing stakeholder expectations. And sometimes these stakeholder expectations, hand on heart, can be unrealistic. So, it's like driving at 150 miles per hour in the middle of the city and in the middle of the night with no headlights. Doesn't sound like a good situation to be in, right? Think about, dark streets, think about potholes on the roads in most of developing Asia, think about traffic on the road, think about rogue drivers, and it is a short recipe for disaster. And metaphorically speaking, that is what happens in most organizations or in a lot of organizations. I'm sure if we think hard, we can think of at least a few examples of organizations that have struggled in the past. What leaders like you and me need is a set of navigators, and better still, navigators with floodlights. Navigators who can sit in our metaphorical cars and help us drive our cars, aka the organizations, forward. Navigators who can show us into the future using the floodlights. The board directors play that role of navigators. But again, as I said earlier, not a lot of boards are able to play that role or are equipped to play that role. And when we were doing this research, we heard terms like boards are big boys club, boards lack courage, boards, independent board directors do not give their 100%. They are subservient to these to the majority shareholders, and so on and so forth. In fact, as you can see on the graph on the bottom left of your slide, 1 in 2 board directors highlighted that 1 or more of their peers should be replaced because they're either not capable, or they are not adding value, or they do not have the courage to stand up to the majority shareholder and the strong management. Now, add to this relatively weaker jurisdiction in most of developing Asia, including Sri Lanka. Add to this a national culture in most of Asia that is about harmony, that is about hierarchy, which impacts board operations and board dynamics. Also add to this concentrated shareholding. A lot of family-owned businesses in our part of the world, government runs the largest organizations and so on. And that's the backdrop in which the boards operate. Now, with this backdrop, let me share with you 7 key takeaways from our research. The first takeaway is about governance itself. So, the first big takeaway from the study was that governance is necessary, but not sufficient to make organizations future ready. The board leaders and the management combination is. The leaders in the boardroom, senior executives around the board table need to play that role and take accountability to make organizations future ready. Good governance is just for good security. That was the big learning we had. When we looked at the governance evolution across Asia in different countries, we realized that Till mid 1990s, it was what we call phase one of board leadership, where the controls were mainly in the hands of promoter or the family. Then after 1997-98 financial fiasco, all hell broke loose, and the regulators and the governance machinery swung the pendulum all the way to the other side to include a lot of regulations and governance changes. And they are highlighted on the, for instance, Sri Lanka came up with the Companies Act in 2007. Thailand came up with the Securities Exchange Act in 2008. 2009, Philippines came up with their corporate governance code. 2013, India came up with the Companies Act. 2016-17, Malaysia came up with the Companies Code and a Companies Act. Singapore did the same a year later, and then last year, even Vietnam, which has been lagging in terms of their corporate governance maturity, introduced what they call Decree 71, which is a combination of governance laws and bylaws that they introduced and corporate governance code. So despite all of this, we saw a bunch of scandals in the last 5 years, and most of these changes were targeted at killing the duality between the chairman and the CEO role, providing more independence to independent director, and looking at critical elements like minority shareholder rights and so on. Now, this is phase two of board leadership, according to our research, which is about more independence to independent directors. But as I said, despite all of these changes, irrespective of the country, last 5 years has seen some of the worst corporate governance scandals across Asia. I promised myself I'll not name names, organization names today, but think of automobile companies in ASEAN or in Pacific. Think of FMCG companies across ASEAN. Think of banks and financial institutions in South Asia, and I'm sure you get the clue. Why did that happen? Where did we go wrong despite corporate governance? Corporate governance maturity and introduction of corporate governance code. Perhaps lies in the new narrative that you need board leaders to provide the necessary leadership to the organization, and corporate governance is not. Sorry, somebody's shared their screen. Can you hold off on doing that? Yeah, can you see? I'm hoping you can see my screen. So please don't take the screen sharing rights away. So and the new in terms of providing leadership to the organization, and board leadership, which is collective, needs to do that. Collective is the key word. Having independent directors who are rock stars, big names by themselves will not help. You need the board to play a collective leadership role. So collective leadership, accountable leadership, and future fluent leadership is what we are calling bold 3.0, board leadership 3.0. Now, a quick question for you. As you think about, let's say, the organizations that you are familiar with in Sri Lanka, where do you think they stand in terms of phase one, phase two, or phase three of board leadership? Again, it'll be nice if you can plug your responses in the comments box, and it'll be nice to get some responses from people. Okay, I lost my presentation again, so yeah. So it'll be nice to get some responses while I'll go along to the next takeaway. So the first takeaway is that board leadership needs to be collective, board leadership needs to be accountable, and board leadership needs to be future fluent. Governance is not enough. The second takeaway is around what exactly is board leadership? I've been using this term for a while, board leadership. What is board leadership? Board leadership is, again, board providing the critical partner or synergistic support or leadership to the management to take the organization's future ready, especially in times like these when our CXOs need help in terms of making our organizations ready for the post-COVID world. Now, if board leadership was so easy, everybody would have done it by now. However, our research shows that board leadership happens when several related elements, related yet distinct elements, fall in place together. Just like a house, board leadership happens when you have a strong foundation, pillars to provide resilience and beams to provide resilience, and a strong roof. Now, let me explain here. Now, by the house model, I mean, as you can see on the bottom right of the slide, the foundation of board leadership sits in governance maturity at a country level and at a company level. At a country level, it is a function of the jurisdiction in which the country is sitting, the strength or the impactfulness of the institutions, also the national culture, the philosophy, the governance philosophy, whether it is rules-based or principle-based, and so on. That decides, elements like corruption perception, minority shareholding rights, the teeth that the institutions and the regulatory bodies have, and so on. While the board directors do not have any control on country governance maturity, the success of the board leadership is linked to the country governance maturity, because the organization exists in the context of the entire country. Also, the second element in the foundation is the company governance maturity, which is mainly governed by how serious the shareholders are, or the majority shareholder is, in terms of providing top-notch governance. Essentially, it is about transparency, accountability, and security in terms of organizational operations. As I said earlier, a lot of the maturity, governance maturity at a company level depends on not only the shareholders, but on the shareholding pattern of the organization. A government organization often lacks, and I'm stereotyping here, often lacks, for instance, things like accountability to the independent board. Family-owned organizations, also, there is a question mark around how independent the independent directors are. In an MNC, it is about who calls the shots, whether the headquarters or the in-country operations calls the shots, and so on. For a PE firm, for instance, there is a risk that they will have a short-term view and not a long-term view on the organization. So, however, while foundation is critical, it does not guarantee board leadership to happen. There are 4 pillars that stand atop the strong foundation of corporate governance and country governance maturity. And these pillars in front of you are, number 1, what is the motivation of the independent director to join the organization in their board? Is it about paying their bills? Is it about corporate calling card? Is it about an ego boost? Or is it about a post-retirement career? Or the board director genuinely wants to make a difference in terms of making organization future ready and better governed? That's the first pillar, which decides how strong the board leadership is. The second pillar is about the capability. Now, most organizations, when I talk about capability, often think about functional skills and technical skills. Do the board directors know how to look at the books of accounts? Do they understand risk mitigation? Do they understand the regulations? Do they understand governance philosophy? Or do they understand the laws and bylaws of the land, and so on? And therefore, you see an overdose of CEOs, chartered accountants, and corporate lawyers, that dominate the boards. However, very few organizations think about making collective leadership happen. The argument is logical. When I speak to CEOs and board chairs, they say, we've hired ex-CEOs on the board. Why do we need leadership to happen? These guys are leaders, and they've done leadership for several decades in their life before they joined the board. However, and for those of you who are board leaders already, you'll appreciate that operating at a board and operating at a CEO level is hugely different. And in fact, I would go on one limb and tell you that the sure shot way to get the board to fail or get a fractured board is get 10 or 11 CEOs on it. Too many egos to manage, the board structure or the board dynamics will break in month 1 or month 2. I can promise you that. So, in terms of board capability, organizations need to think beyond functional and technical skills. The third element is board mandate. Who does what? What is the responsibility of the board? What is the responsibility of the shareholders? What is the responsibility of the committees? What is the responsibility of the lead director, independent directors, executive directors, the chair, the CEO, the management team, company secretary, and so on? All of that, is it clear? And is it crystal clear in terms of who does what? For instance, is the chairperson a senior CEO, quote unquote, a senior CEO, or is the chairperson a guide to the CEO? I see a lot of organizations running into questions like these. Therefore, it's critical that the mandate is clear, the KPIs are clear for the board, and they are measured honestly by the collective board itself. The fourth pillar is around composition. And when I say composition, I mean diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean more than just gender diversity. A lot of organizations have pushed the envelope at least a little bit on gender diversity, but a lot of organizations are not even thinking about functional skills diversity, diversity in nationalities, diversity in ethnicities, diversity in experience, in education, in generations. Do you need a young board director, for instance? Well, you should get a young board director if you're selling something that is of value to Gen Z and Gen Y. So, anecdotal evidence suggests that if boards are diverse, they're able to add more value. And so these are the four pillars. But despite these four pillars providing resilience to the board leadership model, the leadership model wouldn't work till you have a strong roof, which is the dynamics, which is the board culture, which is the day-to-day functioning at the board level, how relationships play out, how people discuss issues with each other, how open people are, what is the level of trust that board directors have with each other and with the board chair and with the management and the shareholders, the majority shareholders at the very least. So the big takeaway from point number 2 is that making board leadership happen is complex, but it can happen. We are fortunate at CCL of working with a lot of boards in the region, making collective leadership happen. And organizations need to look beyond the obvious. They need to look beyond getting some rock star big names on their boards. They need to think about collective leadership. They need to think about board culture and so on. That's the second big takeaway. The third big takeaway is about why some boards outperform while the others struggle. So as we say in our study, and by the way, you can download the study from our website. In the end, I'll share with you how to download. Now, effective boards have a different DNA. But at the core of the board functioning is, as you see on the right-hand side, supervisory and stewardship responsibility.
Please,
that is the fundamental core.
send me the pricing.
Can I request you to mute yourself, please? Thank you. So at the fundamental of the board functioning is supervisory and stewardship responsibilities, and that is permanent. That will always stay. However, boards that outperform are able to take these responsibilities and not only transform them into fiduciary responsibilities for the organization, but also playing the strategic partner role. Also, new frontier responsibilities or new age responsibilities like change management, like driving innovation and so on in partnership with the management. As boards that outperform play these responsibilities, they play roles such as not only overseeing and approving, which is what 99 out of 100 boards do, they also challenge the management. They advise the management. They also anticipate and future-proof. They help the CEOs and the management team look into the future and plan the strategy accordingly. Boards that do that display 4 critical behaviors. Board directors, who outperform display 4 critical behaviors. Number 1, like a good journalist, they are not scared of asking questions. Number 2, they speak their mind out irrespective of the consequences. Number 3, they display mature judgment in terms of impact of their actions on not only the majority shareholders, not only the employees, not only the revenue, but also minority shareholders, also society, community, the vendors, suppliers, partners, and so on. This element is extremely critical in times like these when organizations are not just centers to create revenue. They have a social responsibility as well. And the 4th behavior is developing trusting relations. Not only developing relations amongst themselves as board directors, but also with the management, the CEO, the shareholders, the employees, and so on. Now, board leaders who are able to do that consistently display leadership capabilities that you see in the outermost part of the wheel: self-awareness, trust, strategic planning, strategic intent, long-term view, empathy, influence, and so on and so forth. Now, I would encourage you to think about which of these capabilities are critical for leaders, for board directors in Sri Lanka. And feel free to sort of add in your responses to the chat box. We'll visit those responses later, because if I try and open the chat box now, I lose my PPT deck. On the next slide, I'll show you what our research found. The sample set was small, so I'll qualify that. The Sri Lanka sample set was not very huge. But when we asked the board directors in the survey, what are the critical skills board directors in Sri Lanka must have, the top 5 were the 5 that are against the blue arrows that you see on the left-hand side: trust and credibility, broad perspective, sound judgment, strategic planning, and leading change. Now, what is interesting is we also tried to figure out what were the big gap areas in terms of skills. And those are that you see on the right-hand side with the red arrows: innovation, learning agility, leading change was also the biggest gap, in addition to being critical, anticipation, and self-awareness. Now, think about the gap areas. 4 out of these 5 gap areas are related to future readiness of the organization: innovation, learning agility, leading change, anticipation, foresight, and so on. And therefore, one of the key takeaways was, while our boards are ready for here and now to steer the organization in the current times, they are not ready to take our organizations into the future, as you can see by the red arrow or gap areas. Also, we tried to identify whether boards are spending time on the most high value adding activities or elements. Now, boards are busy. Let me start by saying that, and board directors are busier. A typical board director spends north of about 300 hours per year on one single board engagement. So if you sit on 4 or 5 boards, you are pretty busy throughout the year. But the billion-dollar question is, are we spending time on the highest value-adding elements? Well, perhaps not. We can do better there. If you look at the arrows, the blue arrows, they highlight where we are spending maximum time. So long-term policies, short-term policies, risk management, business performance, investment decisions. Now, I would question that, do we need to spend so much time on short-term policies, for instance? Or do we need to spend so much time on business performance, which is more historical, rather than looking into indicators or looking at things that can predict the future in terms of organizational performance? When we try to identify where should the boards spend more time or maximum time, you can see those areas on the right-hand side. These are the areas with the red arrows. The board should be clearly spending more time on long-term policies. They should be spending more time on innovation strategy, especially in times like these when the future is unknown. They should be spending time on talent and people issues. It is scary when we collected the data on how much time boards spend on talent discussions. Beyond the CEO, there is very little discussion on talent. And the report has some interesting data sets around that. They should be spending time on culture shaping. They should be spending time on delivering long-term value to the society. So, these are areas where the boards are not spending as much time as they should be spending. Also, boards do not spend enough time on outside-in activities. By outside-in activities, I mean spending time with employees, spending time with clients, spending time with suppliers, spending time with vendors, visiting the various project sites or operation sites of the organization, meeting different people within the organization, and so on. Also, boards do not spend time on self-learning and capability development. And the reasons are plenty. Well, you may do sessions like these. I do spend a lot of time with the boards. Or boards may invite blockchain experts or artificial intelligence experts, but they don't invest time on learning collectively, how to perform better as a collective team, how to perform better as a collaborative team. The reasons are plenty. One of the reasons is that board directors are busy, they don't have enough time. But a bigger reason is a huge ego that a board director typically has. And things may be different in Sri Lanka, but across Asia, I've seen board directors have huge egos, and I'm being totally honest here in the spirit of being candid. And also unrealistic expectations that organizations have of board directors. Hey, I've hired a board director, an ex-CEO. Why do I need to tell him how to lead? He's an ex-CEO. He should know how to lead. And also, practical challenges like who owns the capability development at a board leader level? Is it a nominations committee that owns it? Is it the board chair? Is it the CEO? There's no clear mandate on who owns the responsibility to develop boards. The fifth takeaway is around the culture changes. So when I look at board failures and I realize that, this particular when I look at corporate governance scandals, I often look at the board of directors in that organization. And when I see big names, I often wonder, what were they smoking? What were they thinking? Where were they? Were they sleeping when all of this was happening right under their nose? The answer often lies in the dynamics at the board level. The culture that the board has, or the board culture. Our research suggests that there are 5 elements that decide the culture at the board level. Number 1, collaboration. How good the board directors are in collaborating with each other, with the management collectively, with the shareholders, with shareholders, with minority shareholders, and how good is the full board in collaborating with, let's say, committees and so on. The second element is commitment. Are the board directors committed to not only giving their best to the organization, but also developing their own capabilities, commitment towards getting better at their skill or their art or their profession? Number 3, does enough challenging happen at the board level? And by challenging, I don't mean fighting, or I don't mean speaking over each other. I mean a healthy debate to arrive at the best decisions. And whether there is candor and transparency, not only about how the board is operating, but also how the board is performing. Because, board evaluation, and pardon me for saying that I'm a researcher, I can get away with this. Board evaluation is a big joke. Half of the organizations do self-evaluation, most of the rest do collective evaluation. Very few do third-party evaluation at the board level. It's a big joke. Hey, we are a big happy family, so we're all doing okay, we're all doing well. Hey, let's get to the next agenda item. So we need to be more transparent around our own performance if we want to develop a sharper board or a more capable board. All of these 4 elements are deep-rooted in trust. And trust is a combination of how much confidence I have in my peers, credibility, integrity, and loyalty. And trust is what holds this 4CT model together. Now, good board culture looks like a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, board chair inviting different people to participate, irrespective of their point of view, people being completely fearless in terms of sharing their points of view, a lot of dialogue, a lot of discussion, and decisions being taken. Bad board culture is a fractured board. Bad board culture is about the CEO sharing a 400-page board pack one day before the board meeting. Bad board culture is about board directors not talking to each other, or a lot of fighting happening, or a lot of discussion happening, but no decisions being taken. Now, depending on how these 4 CTs play out, the boards can be categorized into 4 buckets. A rubber stamp board, which is always rubber stamping what the management proposes without debate or with very little debate. The watchdog board, which we see mainly in regulated industries, where boards are mainly highly concerned about the compliance requirements. Most of the rest is left to the management. A sparring partner board, where boards and management wrestle with each other to arrive at the best decision. And a future fluent board, that not only where boards and management not only wrestle with each other, they are also looking into the future and taking critical decisions in terms of strategy to make the organization successful down the road. The sixth way is around future of boards. Now, I'll be completely honest, when I interviewed 109 board directors, I did not hear a lot of confidence in terms of the changes that are happening at the board level. Not a lot of confidence. A lot of board directors were like, hey, things are unlikely to change in the short term. In the long term, however, there are 4 areas that may change or are seeing slow change, I would say. The context is very quickly changing across the boards. So, the shareholders are getting more demanding. Regulators are getting more demanding. There is we are beginning to see elements of shareholder activism in different countries in Asia. Also, there is more focus on new age technologies, and boards are typically presented with multi-million-dollar proposals from the management on technology. So technology is getting important. So the context is changing. Also, the composition is changing slowly. And by composition, I mean looking beyond diversity, getting younger board directors, getting board directors that have different skills, that have different nationalities, different ethnicities, and so on. Also, the dynamics is changing at the board level. Board meetings are becoming shorter. We are seeing virtual board meetings. Remember, we did this research before COVID, and we were hearing the possibility of virtual board meetings, and bang on, they are happening as we speak. Also, board tenures are likely to become smaller. Boards are likely to become smaller, but the meetings will become more frequent. And the board focus is changing. Focus towards technology, focus towards sustainability, environment, and talent. So 4 areas where we'll see shifts: context, composition, dynamics, and focus. The 7th takeaway and the last takeaway is about what should boards do in current times. And this comes from a paper that I and my colleague authored recently on 6 paradoxes that organizations and leaders must navigate. So boards must help the management deal with the 6 paradoxes that are highlighted on the bottom right. Slow down or go fast. So is this the time when we are hit by a challenge to slow down and look within, or should we start sprinting? That's a paradox. The second one is about how much technology is too much technology so that we do not lose human touch. Everybody is talking about technology at this point, but too much technology is also not good because it might result in lower engagement at an employee level. Number 3 is about cost. How much cost do I cut so that I do not hurt the muscle of the organization permanently or the core of the organization permanently? Boards need to help management take these decisions. Also, how do I globalize my business model on top of digital? So do I have an option to have a digital element of my business? If yes, how do I ramp it up quickly? How do I deal with localized profit and localized supply chains? That's the 4th paradox. The 5th paradox is about flexibility and control. While I provide flexibility to my employees, how do I set control processes in place so that the productivity is not lost? And the last paradox is about empathy and tough love. We need to be empathetic towards our employees, especially survivors, because a lot of people in a lot of countries are losing jobs at this point. But we also need to display tough love to our employees to tell them, hey, you need to ramp up on incremental capabilities because the world post-COVID will be different. So the boards must support management deal with these 6 paradoxes. And I'm sure all of you or most of you are dealing with one, or I'm guessing more of these paradoxes as we speak. Finally, let me summarize this before I bring this research to life via the panel discussion. There are 4 actions that boards must take to be future ready. Number 1, evaluate the governance maturity of the company and the country, the context in which they operate. Number 2, reflect on leader intent. Get the leaders or the board directors with the right intent, not leaders who are looking for post-retirement careers, but leaders or directors who are really looking to provide value to the organization. And build their capabilities, collective, collaborative leadership capabilities. Number 3, assemble a compelling team, diverse team, team with different capabilities, and establish clear KPIs and mandate in terms of board responsibilities, and measure those KPIs on an annual basis or 6-monthly basis. And number 4, curate a culture based on 4CT, which is the 4CT culture based on trust, collaboration, candor, commitment, and challenge that I talked about. There are some tips on the bottom right for next generation board directors. Number 1, for independent board directors, new independent board directors, be careful. You could be prosecuted if you mess up in your board leadership role. So before you sign up for a board leadership role, be careful. Be smart to understand the strategy and politics in the organization. So be canny. Be committed to not only your own development, not only towards giving the best to the organization as a board director, but also mentoring next generation board directors. Be connected with the board director community. Play a key role with SLID and other such director bodies. And 4, be courageous. Irrespective of the outcome, make sure you get your comments recorded. Make sure you ask the tough questions, Because going back to point one, you could be prosecuted or you could be in deep trouble if you choose to keep quiet when critical decisions that could lead the organization in trouble are being taken. With that, let me share with you, that you can download this study. It's a comprehensive study. You can download the study. We will also be sharing the Sri Lanka cut of the study with SLID and my colleagues at Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and maybe they can circulate it to the participants. But the full study is on our website. You can download that. If you can't find it, I have my email ID there, puris@ccl.org. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll direct you to the study. Now, before I close the sharing, three things that you may want to take away from this sharing. Number one, corporate governance is necessary but not sufficient to make your organizations future ready. Corporate governance can make your organization safe but not future ready. The board directors can. A synergistic role between boards and management can. Number two, when you think about skills at a board director level, please think beyond functional and technical skills. You need collaborative skills at the board level. You need collective leadership skills at the board level. And number three, as you think about challenges you may be facing at the board level, think about board culture and think about 4CT. Feel free to send in the questions if you have about the presentation in the comments box, and I'll take those later when we open it up for dialogue. But for now, let me bring this research to life and share four very senior board directors. We have Rajendra Thiagaraja, who's the managing director and CEO of Cargill's Bank and sits on multiple boards. We have Ms. Aroshi Nanayakara, who's the CEO of Global Consulting Company and I know sits on several boards. Dr. Rainer Deutschmann, who's a group COO of Dialog Axiata, and interestingly, he sits on global boards, and he'll bring in an interesting perspective this afternoon. And we have Mr. Anushka Vijay Sinha, who's a director at Ceylon Bank and Fair First Insurance. So let's bring this research to life through the experiences and eyes and sharing of these four very senior leaders. I'll stop sharing the presentation so that perhaps the four panelists can switch on their camera. That might be just helpful. Okay, so without wasting much time, so I have just one or two questions for the panelists, and then I'll open it up to the participants, and I'm hoping they'll be interesting questions. And feel free to send in those questions in the dialogue box, and I'll be your voice today. So we'll not open the audio, but if you type in the questions, I'll read those questions out for you. Depending on the time we have, we'll try and take as many questions as we can. So the first question is for you, Thea, Mr. Rajendra Thiagaraja. Tell us, how have boards evolved, in Sri Lanka, especially talking about a mix of traditional organizations which have more traditional settings at the board level, and also new age organizations, that are into technology, that are into new age skills and capabilities, and so on. So talk a little bit about board evolution in Sri Lanka.
Thanks, Sunil. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'll in the 3 minutes allocated, I'll try to first touch on the conventional board and then also talk a bit on how I see the evolution of the future savvy new economy boards. I'm talking with maybe 20, 25 years of experience in 3 bank boards and a couple of diversified conglomerate boards. One thing, the first point I'd like to stress is that there is an increased recognition of collective responsibility at the board level, especially from independent non-executive directors. Gone are the days when somebody comes into a boardroom and says, I am not management, I am not exec, I don't understand, and I need exemption. I think people recognize that when you are responsible, you're liable, whether you're equally liable, whether you're non-exec or exec. So I think that's now pretty predominant. Secondly, I think as a result of that, I think the need for proper time, commitment and focus, I think I've seen that evolve over the years. Secondly, we spoke about gender. I know that probably Aroshi will touch on this, but certainly if I look at a 10-year horizon from 2003 to 2013, the very first bank board I was representing, In 2003, there were 0 out of 9. In 2013, there were 3 out of 13. Sorry, 3 out of 10. And in 2003, 0, so there was 1 out of 9 independent directors. In 2013, there was 6 out of 10. So I think there's a gradual evolution, and maybe the introduction of the codes have also helped to bring in that structured element. While I still agree with you that an overbearance of independence also, I think, tends to have a negative impact when it comes to driving ownership and business. That's the point. There is certainly increased usage of technology. I won't say modern digital disruption, but basic level technology in boardroom engagement. It's nice to see people not insisting on being physically present. They can, most boards log in from wherever they are using modern tools like BoardPack. I think is a certainly a progression also in terms of privacy. One thing, unfortunately, we have not yet seen, or I have not seen in most conventional old economy boards, is the willingness to be digitally disrupted at the boardroom. I think whenever somebody is looking at that subject, people tend to prefer engaging consultants rather than developing your in-house disruptor. And this is something distinctly I see talking to most of my colleagues who are running the new economic companies. They actually actively encourage digital disruption in the board, here value. Uh, One thing I also noticed, maybe because of the banks being more regulated, there's a structured approach to boardroom engagement and conversation. Certainly over the last few years, we see increasing better use of board subcommittees to really dive deep into technical subjects, and as a result of that, the main board spending more time on strategy and surprisingly also on talent. I think that's something positively I've experienced that. Uh, Another thing which I've certainly experienced from independent directors over the last 10 years, directors are demanding structured induction when people come. That is probably because of a correlation between realizing that there is responsibility. So they need, there's a thirst to try to understand what they're getting into. So the need for a structured induction is certainly there. Yes, overpowering CEO and or encouragement of the CEO. I think there is still probably a 50-50, but it's nice to see a gradual emergence of boards trying to be consultative and supportive of board CEOs and KMPs rather than trying to intimidate. So that's also, I think, happening. Self-evaluation, I see, as you quite rightly said, you see the usual tick and bash, but I'd like to share something. In addition to the bank boards I serve on, the two independent roles I play, even though the respective boards don't push for a formal annual board evolution, I actually go up to the chair and push him and say, tell me, am I giving value? Do I need to be reappointed? Tell me. Because if I am not creating value, I don't need the fees. And I hope more and more people will do that, because that will certainly create that culture of wanting to be constructively critiqued. A few specific comments on the new economy companies. One thing we notice is the size, both sizes tend to be smaller, far more functionally focused, certainly more digitally disruptive and digitally encouraging, and very much focus on customer value and demanding a share of the pie rather than sitting back on fees. And I think they can afford to do that because of the private nature of it. A lot of these new companies, the new generation boards tend to cut through what I call the crap. Don't waste their time on sustainability rewards or annual report recognitions. They just get on to performance, delivering value and demanding a share of the value, which I think is very much akin to future savvy. And one more thing, uh, very little dependency on listing, but more dependency and engagement of private equity. So it's a different type of capital, um, thirst for capital, which also I think helps, unlike a structured listing environment, to be more focused on the business rather than being overpowering with governance. So those are my a few initial thoughts, Sunil.
Sunil, you're muted. You're muted.
I'm sorry. So thanks, Thea. I was saying that you are you are in a unique spot where you are a CEO and you also sit on boards. At some point in the conversation, I'll come back to you to understand more how does a CEO and chairman good dynamics play out. So maybe we'll reserve that question for later. Aroshi, over to you. Talk a little bit about diversity. And there is no board conversation is complete. And I spend a lot of time with boards. No conversation is complete without a dialogue on diversity. Yet I see that, very few boards are looking beyond gender diversity at this point. Talk a little bit about how we can make diversity happen at the board level in Sri Lanka. What is the role of the organization, the chair, the CEO in making that happen?
So I think, Sunil, we've started this whole conversation in terms of gender diversity. I think we've come a ways with gender diversity, where we were, as a statistic, we were 8.3% of boards, of board directors, PLCs, consisted of women. And that was 2 years ago. We pushed that bar a little higher now, but we are trying to get at, the Sri Lankan Institute of Directors and the SEC were instrumental in passing policy, hasn't been gazetted as yet, but passing policy on getting a quota in for, it's called a progressive quota, because we are not trying to push boards into just appointing anybody. We want them to appoint people who are suitable, who are competent. So a progressive quota where end of this year, they have to answer if they don't have, it's a 30% we are looking for. If they don't have 30% of their board members as women, being women, by end of 2022, so it's just answering why. Why do you not have? By end of 2022, we are looking at 20% board seats occupied by women. And by end of 2024, we are looking at that 30% really, coming in onto boards and bringing that diversity in terms of gender onto the boards. Having said that, you were talking of delivering to the generation X, Y, Z, and we are already doing that. We are, our market is that. So if you were to take in terms of a market, 53% of the population, world population, or 50% of the world population, higher than that, consists of women. And we're just breaking into that ground where we're saying probably 50% in terms of numbers. In terms of buying decisions, probably it's 80 to 90% buying decisions are made by the women in terms of households and all of that. So we are getting that part now pretty much on the agenda. Everybody recognizes that you do need to have gender diversity on your boards. In terms of expertise, I think we do a pretty good job already. Increasingly, you have IT savvy people, IT specialists who are coming onto the boards, because that is completely the new wave. And we really need to, as boards, get ready for that. And so the nominations committee, the chairpersons are playing a key role in that. in looking at a skill set and the gaps that you have on the board, and then trying to see who is the best suited to fill that role, rather than looking at, you know, whose best friend am I, you know, going to bring onto the board. In terms of age, I don't think we are thinking enough, because across the board, many boards have the, you know, the older generation board members still on the boards. While that is excellent, we do need their expertise and their vision and their, you know, the exposure they have had. We also need to bring in the younger generation who is going to be the market out there, and they understand technology. They're born with it, they live it. So we need to start reducing the average age on our boards. So that is a key point, I think, that we need to start making. Financial services industry, because as Tia and I are both on bank boards, because of the regulations, because of the compliance requirements, and because of the monitoring that happens consistently, we are pushed to it. And I think even with the gender equation, once you get one woman onto the board or a one young board member in there, and you understand their the contribution they're making, the sell becomes much easier. So the regulation part or the quotas help just to get that, you know, first entry in there, and then the value is created, and that the pull from a board really starts to happen. So I would think we have really come a long way in Sri Lanka. Public sector public sector is a little behind, but I think the government is looking at how to really structure nomination committees and get people onto boards, you know, capable people onto boards. So PLCs are all at a very, you know, pretty good level. Private companies do need to start thinking of it a little more, and I think the real selling point needs to be that it is in their best interest. If they are short-term profit-oriented, it is absolutely the right thing to do, even if you're short-term profit-oriented, to get that balance and that diversity.
Okay. Thanks, Aroshi. You know, interestingly, the jury is out whether quotas is the best way to go about getting gender diversity. Maybe it can help kickstart, but a lot of countries have had limited success with quotas beyond a point. So yeah, but the jury is out on that. Also, in terms of, you know, a quick data point in terms of the age diversity, the oldest leader I interviewed for this research was in his early 90s, board director, early 90s. Okay. Now, very sharp gentleman, and, you know, very sharp gentleman, and I had a good dialogue with him. But then one of the questions that was lingering in my head as I was having that dialogue is, you know, physically, how fit is a person in terms of playing a critical role at a board level, active role at a board level? So again, you know, I'm not being opinionated, just throwing a question there. So also, you know,
if you take just to kind of add into that comment, if you take there are leaders like Mahathir Mohamad who are leading countries past the age of 90. If you take most of our countries, including Donald Trump, right? I'm not a proponent or anything like that, but I'm saying, you know, he's running one of the biggest economy in the world, and he's over 70. So to be very frank, it's the individual, I think. It's not the age, but how do we make sure? So just because we want somebody younger, we don't want to just, you know, pick somebody. We need to have that, it's that individual who will make that contribution. Yeah. Okay.
Fair point. Fair point. Yeah. Rainer, jumping over to you, you know, you are privileged to sit on a bunch of global boards. About what can Sri Lanka learn, or Sri Lankan boards learn, or organizations learn from perhaps the boards and how they operate in other, maybe more advanced jurisdictions?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion and round. I think it's a highly important conversation that we are having. And it's great to hear your research as well as the aspects from the panel members. I have had, like you said, the very lucky situation of being able to work in very different continents and to work for very different companies. For example, Deutsche Telekom in Europe, which is a larger telecom provider across quite a number of countries. McKinsey and Company, where we have been consulting quite senior stakeholders and major industry players. Then more recently, I've had immense pleasure to help get a new telecom provider started in India called Reliance Jio, which was a fairly disruptive move, and obviously navigating in a very agile and challenging environment for a new player coming in. Now being honored by having the chance to work for Axiata Group and leading the business at Dialogue, which is a highly ethical and values-driven company with great colleagues. Also, I have a very different experience by sitting on the board of a company called Rain. Rain is again a new telco that was started in South Africa as a greenfield operation, coming into a market which already seemed crowded, but there was an utter demand for fast internet at affordable prices. And so this company came in and really is starting to disrupt the market again in a region where you have a wide, I think, under penetration of affordable data because of the low income levels that we see there. And I think what my experience is that across all these impressions that I've gained, there's a number of things where the companies always have to be mindful. And I think the boards are in a very privileged position to help the companies. And what are these things? I think the leaders in a company sometimes are very focused, and of course have to be very focused, but sometimes maybe too focused on the local market condition, on the local employee condition, on executing well, having a focus on operation excellence. That is all important. What the board, I think, can bring in addition, and I think some of the things you have said in your research, and we have even heard from the other panelists. So there is a we are not a regional and local a set of pockets anymore, even though there are now what is called deglobalization trends. But in general, if you look, it's become a global community, and technologies are making no difference in reality whether I'm using in one or the other region. So having board members who have a visibility across the planet of different technologies and infusing them in an appropriate way is one key, I think, aspect that we can acknowledge. Secondly, employee practices. If I look at what is happening with my employees, how do I manage? How do I attract talent? How do I groom internal talent? How do I blend in external talent? Is another aspect where I think the board can help tremendously. Customer and changing customer demands is another one where sometimes going by customer research, you'll be looking at a bit of a more shorter term demand and sentiment, but some of the customer developments that we see actually are not visible. If I look very closely and ask people, sometimes there are customer trends which are coming a little beyond the horizon of a quarter or a half-year result. And again, on customer trends, it is very useful to have boards that are coming in and kind of challenging the existing way of how the customer and go-to-market approach might look like currently. And then, of course, looking at legal and regulation more recently, as all of us are involved in especially data privacy matters. We have started to see very early in Europe the GDPR coming up, and it has now percolated across, I think I would even say, the planet, in the US and in Asia, whereby data privacy regulations have really kept us busy, and boards that have been having the visibility of, let's say, a European development of the GDPR have been helping other players outside of Europe even to embrace even the opportunities, not only the challenges but the opportunities that are coming with such a regulation, and to be having a readiness early and even creating a USP. And last but not least, I think on the side of the shareholders and the investors and the investor community, again, there's a huge role boards can play by having a visibility of let's say the global investor community. What are the KPIs people are looking for? Where are funds available, and so on. So above all of these aspects, I think that you have mentioned, I wanted to just emphasize three more points that I find important in terms of the role of the board. And again, you have mentioned so many, so it's hard to even add something, but I wanted to add three at least focus points. One is the board plays also a role as I think somewhat how to call it. The board is typically and should be visible also for the external world. Even to an extent that if I'm a talent and I'm looking to apply and work for a company, I will look for the board directors. I will look for the history of the board, and I will look for who are the people that are governing the company above and beyond the executive management team. So I think the board should be mindful of the fact that there is an external impression created by the board itself and by the profiles and the way how the board is actually acting as far as it is visible in the public. And it is creating not only an impression, of course, for the public, for customers, and for partners, but especially for talent. I think that aspect we should recognize, and you haven't mentioned in your research, but I would humbly add to it. Second, another aspect that I would like to add is boards shouldn't be holding back on helping the business itself. I mean, we are basically not only there to give outside in guidance, but we have connections, we have business relationships, we have personal relationships. We can use those relationships and connections also to help the actual business, at least to introduce, right? You don't make the business, you're not going to be making the deal, but you can introduce the right people to each other. You can introduce technologies, innovations, and maybe talent, so that the executive management team can take it up and take their choice. And last but not least, and I think that what you have mentioned is this kind of global perspective and the global challenges around these dimensions that I mentioned: technology, customer, regulation, talent, employee management, investor community. So that is, I think, an utmost important part of the board members to bring in, to make sure that the executive management team has and maintains a 360 view on the business beyond the immediacy of the next quarterly results. So that is my humble addition to your great research, and thanks again for having me. I really enjoy learning from you and participating in this round.
Thank you, Rainer. And at some point, I'll come back to you, because one of the things that we were looking at in the study is around how do boards get smart on technology? Cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, blockchain. A host of proposals land on the board table, a multi-million-dollar proposal sometimes. How do boards quickly get ramped up in terms of taking an objective point of view on those proposals? So since you operate in that world, I'll come back to you later with a question around that.
Okay.
For now, Anushka, the next question is for you. And before I ask Anushka the question, please send in your questions or comments if you have any. I've received a couple, and I'll be asking those questions. But if you have more questions, based on the responses of the panelists, send in those questions, and I'll be your voice this afternoon. So Anushka, tough situation. Organizations are struggling. Sri Lanka is kind of lucky that hasn't seen a lot of downside of the current COVID situation directly. But I'm sure the businesses are suffering, because Sri Lanka is an export-led economy majorly, and heavily dependent on tourism and so on. So tell me, as businesses struggle with a situation like this, which is new to the world, new to the CEO, the CEOs do not know how to handle this, or they are learning how to handle this as we speak. What is the role that boards can play? How can boards, help the organizations overcome the current challenges due to the current pandemic or due to any crisis on the scale that we are seeing at this point?
Thanks for that question, Sunil. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'm very happy to be part of today's event. And Sunil, it's good to connect again. Having been one of the folks you interviewed during the research stage, it's nice to kind of read the final product now and see the insights coming from across the region. On your question, I'm sure many people will have different views on this. I will come at it primarily from the perspective of being on the boards of 3 financial services companies, which, as you know, operate in a highly regulated environment, and particularly in Sri Lanka, is a sector that is under a lot of strain, given the kind of the relief burden that has been passed on to the financial sector. In answering your question, I'll point to probably 3 priorities or 3 areas. The first is around being anticipatory. So as we know, particularly during this pandemic, that it's a constantly changing landscape, constantly changing business conditions, regulatory issues, government policy directions changing. So I think the board itself being anticipatory and in turn passing on that anticipatory insights and the rhythm of being anticipatory onto the management is an important one to do. So I think with the rich diversity that many of the boards in Sri Lanka have and the rich experiences, anticipating where regulations and direction.
Hi, can you switch off? Can you just mute yourself, please? Except for the speaker. Okay. Anushka, go ahead.
Yes, so I think with the diversity and experiences that are on many of our boards, anticipating where regulations and directions could head, anticipating what kind of policy measures are likely, what have previous occasions, obviously not a previous pandemic, but what have previous economic conditions like this told us about what kind of things to anticipate, how our companies have responded, how governments have responded, how regulators have responded, how the sector has responded, and using that to distill some level of anticipation in the near to medium term. I think I think that's important, given that in a very unusual pandemic situation like this, with a lot of things changing, the board doesn't want to also add to that uncertainty and that the management might be dealing with, right? So to provide a step outside of that, where we can kind of read this, read this radar and anticipate what kind of things what kind of scenarios are likely to build in. I think one side comment in this, a big challenge that all of our organizations will probably have to face in a post-pandemic kind of environment is this idea of planning. So most organizations tend to do a 5-year strategy, 3-year plans, etc. And I would hazard that era is kind of over. It'll be more or less identifying, yes, there are, in a 2 to 3 year horizon, there are certain things, that objectives we want to chase after, kind of the true north goals of the organization. But within that time frame, bringing a lot more anticipation, helping the management to learn quickly from what's working, what's not working, and quickly adjust and keep growing. Because I think that era where we, had a board level review of a strategic plan every year or every 2 years is pretty much dead, and it has to be a lot more anticipatory. The second aspect would be on cutting through the noise and the clutter. You talked about the headlights, Sunil, and I would think, to play on that analogy, it would probably be the fog lights. These big 4x4 vehicles have fog lights when going into misty conditions. And I think in these uncertain times, there's a lot of clutter and noise, and helping the management and the organization not miss the wood for the trees, cutting through that noise and really interpreting what is happening and the responses needed would be useful, especially in a country like Sri Lanka where it's quite small, there's an echo chamber at times. Helping the organization not get distracted or get misled by all this noise, conjecture, things you hear on the cocktail circuit or now on the numerous WhatsApp groups that everyone's on, I think that's really important. At board level discussions, you don't want to be adding to that conjecture. You want to help to cut through that and kind of put the fog lights on. And the third and final one that I would probably suggest as a priority is looking beyond the pandemic and setting the tone for the organization beyond the pandemic. We know the pandemic won't last forever in its current form, even though the effects of it will last longer. So the things that the company does now, how it deals with its customers, how it deals with other stakeholders, how it acts with the regulator, how it responds to government moves, will all be remembered. And setting that tone for post-pandemic operating environment, post-pandemic reputation and standing of the company is quite important. So the board's role in kind of guiding the organization to ensure that it's not just dealing with the here and now, but truly setting the tone for post-COVID, whether that means the kind of measures that we take relating to the people in the organization within, or the kind of approach we take to products, especially in financial services when people are under a lot of stress, or the approach we take in adhering to government policy, essentially trying to be the custodian of this fine balancing act that the organization has to have and guiding the tone setting. In this, I'll just make a side point before I conclude, and that relates to board composition. Both Sunil and Aroshi talked a lot about gender diversity on boards and talked somewhat about the other one, and that's the other G, which is generational diversity. And I would argue that it is now even more important than before. We're seeing a lot of very substantial shifts during COVID, during lockdown, shifts in the consumer landscape, consumer behavior, attitudes towards certain brands, attitudes towards the kind of messaging of your organization, towards business models, and in general, attitudes towards life and what people care about. And without generational diversity in the board, I think the organization runs the risk of not being attuned to these shifts and missing these out and really missing and not being in step with some of the post-COVID things. And I think anyone who assumes that COVID's lasting impacts will just be, some amount of economic stress, or for the unfortunate patient, some amount of lasting medical conditions, the lasting impacts will be a lot more than that. It will be a fundamental rethinking of what people care about, what people spend their time and money on. And I think having generational diversity at the board level will help make sure the organization is also in tune with those shifts. So I'll end there.
Sure. And thanks for that. And I loved your comment about generational diversity. And I can share that with the participants that out of the 109 directors I interviewed, Anushka was perhaps the youngest or one of the youngest board directors I interviewed for the study. So I'm not surprised to see you talk about generational diversity. Thanks for that. One of the questions that I'll have for you, if we have time, Anushka, is can you learn how to anticipate at a board level? And you talked about plans as well. I was at a meeting, I was with the board a couple of weeks ago, and where the chairman asked the CEO, do you have forget about 6-month plan, 3-month plan, 1-year plan, do you have a 30-day plan in place? So, and when I started my career over 2.5 decades ago, I have seen a 7-year plan by one of the management consulting firms for a large organization. And, in 2 decades, we are talking about a 30-day plan. So interesting. Yeah, I have a couple of questions, so let me dive right in. We do have about 10 minutes. One of the questions, and Thea, you talked about the fact you made a comment around board evaluation. So one of the questions is around how do you convince the board directors for an independent third-party evaluation? Is it just the decision of the chair? Hey, let's do an independent third-party evaluation. But I'm guessing the dialogue is more to get buy-in from the board before you do that. How do you convince the board that we need an independent third-party evaluation, which can be kind of uncomfortable for at least a few on the board?
So what I would say is, I think what we did in the first bank I happened to work for, I think you start off after a big break by doing a collective evaluation. You do it collectively and you get them to send in their feedback to the chair, and then the chair independently has a one-on-one with each director. That was the first stage. After a couple of years, I'm talking about a 9-year horizon. After a couple of years, we got encouragement to shift the one-on-one to a collective boardroom discussion, right? Another 2-3 years. And then I think after the 5th year, we said, let's go into a third party. So I don't think, from my point of view, trying to shake the system overnight, it has to be a gradual buy-in. And when they get more and more comfortable, it tends to work. That was for the very first bank I was in. But for the current bank I serve in, the evaluation is actually, some of the independent directors actually force it. And they force the chairman, they push the chairman to actually come out, and some of them are not afraid in the boardroom to raise their hand and say, Mr. Chairman, I said this. This was my comment, and can we discuss it? So it again depends on the self-confidence of the independent directors or the director to also be willing to take up a particular issue without trying to hide behind anonymity. So it's a cultural thing.
Okay, so Nishan asked this question, and I'm guessing it's a gradual move. Otherwise, it'll be a huge culture shift, in terms of going in for a third-party valuation in year 1. So you literally handhold the directors, get them open to getting a group evaluation, and then eventually you get into a third-party evaluation. Quick question, Rainer, coming back to you. You talked about. I promised I'll come back to you and talk about technology. Rainer, tell us, how do boards get smart on technology quickly? They are taking multi-million-dollar decisions, critical decisions. I'm sure they have CTOs and consultants working with them. But tell me, an independent director who's an ex-CEO, or an independent director who's a chartered accountant needs to take a call on technology. How can he or she get smart on technology quickly?
Yeah, this question we shouldn't only ask for board members, but we should ask for everyone, isn't it? How can we make sure that we are staying up to date? My short answer, as we are nearing the end of the conversation, the short answer is we all have to keep a growth mindset. What does it mean to keep a growth mindset? It means we are eager to learn. I feel, and I think that has been emphasized by my panel colleagues also, it is not about age, it's even not about experience, because in the times of fast change, I would call it exponential change, experience weathers very quickly. So what, however, survives and what makes us, I think, strong executives or strong board members is for us to have an open mind and always keep learning. Whether this is a technology, whether this is a new regulation, whether this is a new customer demand, I mean, it may be any of those dimensions that I was pointing out earlier. I think that is the key asset of, I think, successful people if you look around. In addition, board members, like I said, have the benefit of typically a wide network of people. So a combination of a growth mindset and a wide network of people being able to see a lot of development, being able to talk to a lot of people outside of the specific company can bring a lot of value into the company through the boardroom discussions and all the discussions with the executive team. So I think this is the short answer to you. So there isn't any thing like a silver bullet where you read a website or you read a book or something. So that is not like this. It is about constant learning. And the one last, comment to this is, and we also had this notion around noise and clutter earlier in the discussion. I think the value that a board member can bring, and any senior executive, whoever, actually everyone can bring, is to cut through the clutter by connecting the dots. Many of the innovations that we see are instances of a larger trend, right? And we can talk about so many trends. You have mentioned some, whether it's public cloud, whether it's things like the blockchain, which hasn't really yet come up to full fruition, but everyone has been talking about. Whatever is the trend, there are larger trends, and obviously one of the key trends that we see currently is the use of data for analytics and insights and action from data. Many of the innovations that we see are founded on those larger trends, and I think the board members and the executive management team, their role is to pave the way and not getting distracted by point innovations only and by those things which are coming up, but it is about embracing the larger trends, seeing what platform can we create as a business to leverage the power of any of these larger trends and bring value to our customers. I think that is the key one asset where I think we should all be mindful of, and we can deliver a lot of value, whether it's through the board or through the executive management team or through a young talent in the companies. Doesn't actually matter.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your thoughts, Rainer. One quick comment is about the fact that independent directors must demand for company investment in self-learning. So, Arushi, coming back to you, sorry to put you in the spot. Tell me, who is responsible for board capability development? And just make it a short response since we're almost at time. Who is responsible? Who takes the call that board directors need to develop their capability? Where does the money come from? I'm sure it doesn't come from HR. It comes from some budget somewhere. But tell me quickly, how does it play out?
Well, I think it's not structured enough, to be very frank. If you're taking executive training, there's a budget laid out. You have a foreign training budget, you have a local training budget, and it's pretty, you have a separate budget for coaching, pretty well laid out. When you talk of board training, there is a gray area. I would say it's the chairperson's responsibility to really drive that agenda. Having said that, so nominations committee, board HR committee, chairperson. Having said that, I think it's also the responsibility of each one of us who's coming onto the board to say, hey, I do want some training. And I read this comment in your research saying, one person says, and using the same word, hey, it's awkward to ask for training, right? But it is absolutely necessary for us to do so. And actually, the bank I am on the board of, I came onto the board last year, and so you're thrown into the middle of this whole thing with, especially in financial services, it's a lot of regulation, lot of liability, right? And you really need to get up to scratch quite quickly. So one of the things that, and there were a few others also who came on at the same time. One of the things that we really requested was that we have a very structured board induction program. And I must say, so that's, we have about 4 to 5 like half-day sessions that we are now running for all new boards, so that you're getting up to scratch with the organization. Having said that, I think we need to be looking at how do we upskill ourselves, not just in terms of the business we're in, but in terms of board leadership. And I think that conversation has to happen a little better, particularly in Sri Lanka, probably, where you have a structured budget put in, where it gets looked at on an annual basis or whatever.
Okay, yeah. We are almost at time. There was a great comment by Zofir. He said that we talk of governance all the time and also have equipped ourselves with adequate knowledge. Despite this, there are malpractices, issues on morals, ethics happening. What's the practical solution and the way forward? So good way to end the seminar or end the discussion with a question mark like this. I'm guessing The solution lies with all of us. The solution lies with the you board directors on the call today. The solution lies with business leaders who found the time to join us this afternoon, with quasi-academics like myself. I'm guessing the solution lies in collaboratively finding an answer to that one. We are at 4:30, so let me hand it back to Radhika. Before I do that, I want to thank the panelists, Rajendra, Aroshi, Dr. Rainer Deutschmann, Anushka. Thank you. Thank you for partnering with me this afternoon, and thank you to the panelists and the participants. Radhika, over to you for a formal closure to the webinar.
Thank you, Sunil. It's been a pleasure.
Our story is one of reimagining. Reimagining who you can be, what you can achieve, and how CIMA can support you. As technology and digital platforms disrupt businesses, we are reimagining what the profession can be. We've updated our syllabus to meet the expectation of employers, ensuring CIMA qualified professionals have the skills to make an impact from day one. Reimagine your career. Contact CIMA Sri Lanka.
Thank you to our distinguished panel once again for taking time off your busy schedules to participate in today's session. Once again, Sunil and the CCL team, thank you for partnering with us. And a very special thank you to the Ceylon Chamber as well. A very good evening to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. Bye-bye.